What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to The Common Coder. My name is Josh, and in this video we're going to go ahead and talk about HTML block and inline elements, and we'll even talk about something called Inline-Block, which is basically a combination between the two. We'll also introduce something called the HTML document flow. This will be the default flow for the content that we're putting on the screen. So all of our elements and all of our tags, the default way that they are displayed is referred to as the document flow. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that. And finally, we'll tie everything together at the very end with a demo and build up a quick and easy HTML contact form. Won't be functional because we'll need JavaScript and server-side functionality to do that, but we'll go ahead and put all of our elements on the page so that way we can see all of these concepts in action. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so like I mentioned before, this video is all about HTML block and inline elements, and even something called Inline-Block too. So let's go ahead and scroll down a little bit. All right, so this is an important concept to understand because all HTML elements have a default way that they are displayed. So they can either be block, inline, or inline block. And there's a few other ones, but these are the most common ones. So these are the ones we're going to go ahead and focus on. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the differences between these in a second, but it's important to understand something called the HTML document flow. So what does this actually mean? So when you start putting HTML elements onto a page, there is a default display for each one of the element types. And so not all elements are created equal. Certain elements have different types of display types. And because of that reason, it's important to understand how the content flows together. So this default, this HTML document flow is the normal flow of the elements on the page before we apply any CSS styling. So CSS stands for cascading style sheets. So we can see that here in the second bullet point. The display is actually a styling and presentation concern, but it's important to understand the defaults. And this document flow and these display properties, this block, inline, and inline block, these are all derived from the CSS display property. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about block elements, and we'll look at a few examples of these, and this will make it a little bit more concrete. And the way these things are laid out, it's going to illustrate that HTML document flow that I was referring to. First, let's talk about block elements or block level elements. These types of elements always start on a new line, and they will force a new line afterwards. So whenever you use them, it will stick them on a new line in the page, regardless of what's above it. And then it will force a new line afterwards, regardless of what's below it. Not only do they force a new line, but they will fill the entire width of their parent container. With block level elements, we can set the width and height, but as we'll see, even though you set the width and the height, it still takes up the entire line of the parent container unless you do something special with it. So we're not going to quite get into that just yet, but just know that there's lots of different things that we can do with our layout once we get into CSS. But we want to go ahead and understand the basics. We want to understand the basic document flow and how these elements are displayed by default when we put them on our web pages and web applications. All right, so block elements can also contain other block elements or inline elements. So that's that nesting structure that we've talked about before. Usually they're used to describe sections of content. We can see some examples here. We have a div, which is a generic container. We have a P, which is a paragraph tag. We have our headings, H1 through H6, basically various levels of headings. A form, also block level element. A UL, which is an unordered list, and an LI, which is the list item that exists inside of the unordered list. So let's make this a little bit more concrete and take a look at a few examples. So pretend this is a web page, so this outer box. If I use an H1 element, it will start on its own line. And so you can see here we have an H1. Let's say this one is an H1 element. Its default display is block. There's the closing tag, but this tag, the whole thing, when displayed on the page, is going to take up all of the available width on the page, even though we can't see what's behind it unless we change some of the styling. What we'll see when we get into the demo is it takes up all of the space inside of the page. So same thing for a paragraph. This is a P element. Its default display is also block. Takes up all of the available space within the parent container. In this specific example, the parent container would be the body tag on the HTML document. Then we have an unordered list. An unordered list is also a block element. An unordered list specifically is meant to contain list items. So here is your list items, and you can have one or a whole bunch of them. But both of these are block level elements. So this is going to take up all the width on the page. It's going to start on a new line. And then inside of the UL, we can have our list items. And we can see that the list item will take up all of the available width, basically filling up its parent. And its parent in this case is the unordered list tag since it's nested inside of it. And we'll see a few more examples of this when we get to the demo, but just wanted to kind of explain what's going on here with block elements. So block elements always start a new line, and take up all of the available width within its parent container. All right, next we have inline elements. So inline elements do not start on a new line. They're intended to flow with the content. And as such, they only take up as much space as the content inside, basically only as much space as they need to. With inline elements, you cannot set a width or a height. Inline elements can also contain other inline elements, but they are not able to contain block elements. And there's a little bit of an asterisk here when it comes to anchor tags. So these are going to be your links. You can actually wrap a block element in a link, so that way the whole block of content is a link to something else. So that is one of the exceptions that was introduced with the HTML5 spec, but otherwise, technically it is invalid for inline elements to contain other block elements. Inline elements, typically they're used to add additional styling or context. So we can see some examples here. There's a span, which is another type of inline generic container similar to a div. Div is a block level generic container. But we have an anchor tag, so that's going to be for your links. We have a strong tag, emphasizes a little bit of text. So if you had a paragraph of text and you wanted to essentially bold and make some of that text a little bit more profound on the page, you can wrap that in a strong tag, basically meaning it has more meaning. Similarly, we have an EM tag, which is for emphasis. This is typically something that is going to be italicized within a block of text. All right, so we'll go ahead and scroll down a little bit and look at some inline element examples. So here again, we have a sample web page. This has a paragraph tag, some text in here that says it's a P element. Its default displays block, but we can also contain an anchor tag. So we can see here we have a link, href, which is the attribute that indicates where the link's going to go to. So we have a link to something called example.html. The text for the link is going to be this A in quotes element with link in parentheses. So this part would be the visible link on the page, and we have our closing tag and then the rest of our paragraph. So we're basically using this to mark up part of our text within our paragraph and make this little chunk of text here into a link. And we can see that this is inline, because if we were to render this out to the page, the link would appear right in the middle of the paragraph. It wouldn't force things to a new line. It wouldn't have any type of behavior that we would expect to see from a block element. Same thing here. We saw the UL example with the block level elements, but you can see here inside of the list item, we have this is an LI element with some emphasized text, and you can see that text is wrapped in an EM, so a set of EM tags, meaning emphasis should display by default in italics. We have our closing tag here with our opening angle bracket / EM closing angle bracket, and this is all inside of the LI, which in this case would be the parent element. All right, so the main takeaway here for inline elements, they flow with the content. So they're not meant to stand alone. They're meant to be used within conjunction of something else, typically inside of a block level element of some type. But as we saw in some of the bullet points, you could also have inline elements wrapped inside of other inline elements. So for example, if we wanted this anchor tag to be emphasized, we could wrap this whole thing inside of an EM if we wanted to. The last thing that we need to do is talk about something a little bit more special called inline block. And inline block elements, they function the same as inline elements. However, there's a key difference. The height, the width, and the top and bottom margins can be set. So some examples of these would be an image, input tags, which are typically used for forms, text area, again, also used with forms. Same thing with a select and a button. These function the same as inline elements, so they won't force a new line. They won't force a new line afterwards. They will flow with the content that they are with. However, we can do some block element type stuff with them in setting the height, width, and top and bottom margins. All right, so if we scroll down a little bit, we can see some examples of this. Very similar to the last thing that we saw, we can see that we're using an image here. This is inside of a div, which is a generic block container. So this is going to have an image inside of it, and the image just has a source of example.png. So this would render the image, but then the image itself has a width and height. So it's going to render by default to the width and height of the image. And you can see it's got some text next to it that would show up next to it that says this is a div with an image and some text. Okay, and so I purposely made this box a little bit bigger to show that this can have its own width and height, but it's still going to go ahead and flow with the content. So same thing here with the form tag. So the form tag is a block level element. Then we have a label, which is inline. Text inside is going to be username. And then we're going to put this alongside an input of a type text. So this would be a text box that we can type into. And then underneath that, we have a button with a type of submit. So this button specifically, when used inside of a form, will submit the form, and we can handle that form submission programmatically when we get to JavaScript and server-side programming functionality. But for now, you can see that the input, I could make the input taller and wider than what the default would be. And same thing with the button. I could also make the button taller and wider than what the default would be. And so that is the main difference between inline block elements and regular inline elements, is that you can set the height, the width, and the top and bottom margins, and those will be respected. Where if you try to do that with a regular inline element, it wouldn't work. All right, so now it is time for some demos, and we'll go ahead and use all of these type of elements to build up a HTML form that could be used to maybe submit an email for a mailing list or something like that. So let's go ahead and see how we can create something like that. All right, so for this demo, I'm going to be using something called Visual Studio Code. You can download it from code.visualstudio.com, but feel free to use any text editor that you are comfortable with. I just happen to use Visual Studio Code because I think it's probably one of the best editors that's out there. But you can get it here, code.visualstudio.com. Go ahead and download it. And once you've done that, we can go ahead and start coding. So first thing I'm going to do is open up a terminal. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and make this a little bit bigger, and I'm gonna go ahead and CD into a directory on my machine called code. If you don't have this directory, you can create it by using the make dir command and typing code. And the reason I just call this directory code, it's just a spot where I put proof of concepts, demos, different things like that. So I just like to keep everything in one folder. So you can see if I list out the contents here, you can see I have an HTML demo that I used for a previous video. I'm going to go ahead and create a new directory for the purposes of this demo. So let's go ahead and create a new directory using the make dir command. And so we'll go ahead and call this HTML document flow. And I'll go ahead and CD into that directory. And I'll go ahead and open this directory in Visual Studio Code by typing code. All right, so in case you're not able to open the directory with the code command, you can still open Visual Studio Code. Go ahead and go up to the File menu, click Open Folder, and then find the folder on your machine. So you can see I'm in the code folder already here. So you just find that folder, and then find the HTML document flow folder that we created. Go ahead and click it, and then click Open. I'm going to go ahead and defer this update, close the welcome screen, and go ahead and create an HTML document that we can use. So I'm going to use the little file icon with the plus button. It says new file. So go ahead and click on that. And then I'm going to type index.html. So remember from a previous video, index is basically the starting file of any HTML web page or any HTML web application. It's pretty much a convention. It'll make a little bit more sense when we start talking about servers and things like that. But for now, any file that we create, the very first file that we make is going to be called index.html, because that is what's expected. If a web server was to open this directory, it would look for something called index.html. All right, so to save us a little bit of time, I'm going to go ahead and use something called a snippet to basically create a boilerplate HTML file for us. And in Visual Studio Code, that's super easy. All we have to do is type HTML. And then from this little snippet menu that pops up, all I have to do is click this one that says HTML:5. So if I click that, you can see that it includes our doctop HTML. It includes our opening and closing HTML tags. This represents our HTML document. It adds a lang equals en. So obviously we're recording this in English. The language of this HTML file is in English. So went ahead and added the lang attribute here. Then we have our head. It added our meta charset UTF-8. So this is going to be the standard. I do not need the viewport information. It's a little out of scope for this demo. So I'm going to go ahead and delete it. And then our title, we're going to go ahead and call this HTML document flow. All right, and basically what we're going to do here is use block elements, inline elements, and inline block elements. All right, so the first thing we want to do is go ahead and create a heading for our page, letting the users know where they're at. So like I said, we're going to build something that looks like a contact form, maybe to subscribe to a newsletter or something like that. Go ahead and call this a H1. So opening angle bracket, H1, closing angle bracket. Visual Studio Code will complete that code for me. And then I'll go ahead and call this, please subscribe to our newsletter. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and save that by hitting Command S, or I can go up here to the File menu and click File, Save, or Save All. So I'm going to go ahead and save, and then I'm going to right-click and click Open in Default Browser. And so this is an extension that I have installed. You can install it by going to the Extensions panel here on the left, searching for Open in Browser, and you can see right here, this is the extension that I used to open in browser, and that will give you this context menu, open in default browser. All right, so I'm gonna go ahead and close my extensions panel, open my Explorer panel back up so I can see my file, and let's go ahead and just see what this looks like. So if I click open in default browser, you can see here is my HTML document that we just created. Please subscribe to our newsletter. All right, so the H1 is a block level element, and that means it will take up the entire width of the available space of its parent. It's not super obvious here because the text only goes to this spot right here. However, we're going to go ahead and use something we haven't used yet called the developer tools. And so what I can do is right click anywhere on the page and click inspect. And what this does is it opens up a panel that's got a bunch of stuff in it. So the only thing we really care about right now is this elements tab. And you can see it's giving us a outline of our document. There's our doc type, HTML, head, body. So notice as I highlight over these things, it will actually highlight things on the page that's being rendered on the left over here. So if I hover over the head, you can see the head is not anything that's visible to the user, so nothing's being highlighted. However, the HTML encompasses not only the head, but the body, and the body is something that the user can see. And the body is a block level element. And you can see that it is taking up the entire width of the page. And the same thing with our H1. You can see that even though our text ends about, 1/3 of the way through the page, the element itself actually stretches to fill the entire space. Okay, so this is what it means by block level element. It starts on its own line, fills up the entire space, and then anything else that we put underneath it is actually going to render underneath. So we couldn't add another element underneath the H1 and expect it to show up over here. It would have to show up underneath because of the nature of block level elements. So let's go ahead and go back to our page, and let's go ahead and create a form. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and open up a form tag, and Visual Studio Code will go ahead and auto-complete that for me. And then inside of the form tag, we're going to have something called a label. Okay, so in this case, we want an email. And then go ahead and put this on a new line so we can actually see what's happening here. So a label is an inline element. So before we put our input, let's go ahead and save it. Go back to our browser and refresh. So here's going to be the label for our email, where we're going to go ahead and type in our email address. Let's take a look and see what that label is. So if I go into my elements panel here, can go ahead and expand the form. So notice the form is a block level element, starts on its own line, and it's filling up all of the available space. And then if I hover over the label, notice how the label only fills up as much space as the content inside. So in this case, it's the text email. You can see it highlighted over there on the left, and it's only taking up that much space. You can even see that the width of this thing is only 38.21 pixels. Whereas if I hover over the H1, which fills up all the space, you can see it's 993.6. Okay, so this is the main difference between block and inline level elements. So it's important to understand how these elements will lay themselves out by default. So that way when you're building the page, you know what to expect. And then once we get into CSS, we'll see how we can actually change some of these display properties and manipulate the layout to essentially be anything that we want it to be, but to have the same structure regardless of whatever the layout looks like. All right, so let's go ahead and go back into our HTML, and underneath our label, we'll go ahead and add an input. And the input has a type attribute on it. So type, and type is going to be equal to a certain input type. So you can see that we have a bunch of different types that we can use here. Yeah, type equals button, we'll render a button. A type equals checkbox, we'll render a checkbox. A type equals email, will only allow email addresses to be typed into that input. So that's actually what we want. We don't want some random text in there. We'll go ahead and close that off. And a label and an input go hand in hand with one another. So it's always a good practice to add something called a for attribute on your labels. And this is going to be for email. And what this for represents is the ID of the input that you are attaching it to. So what we actually need to do here is go ahead and add an ID equals email. Okay, so it's a type email input, and then we're giving it an identifier of email, and this will associate this input with this label here. All right, so let's go ahead and save our file, go back to our browser and refresh, and you can see now we have email with a text box where we can type in our email. So we could say like, Josh at thecommoncoder.net. As of right now, we actually have 3 different types of elements on the screen that we've talked about. So we have our block level element, which is the H1. We also have another block level element, which is the form. And then inside the form, we have a label, which is a inline element. And then we have an input, which is an inline block element. Okay, and so here is the main difference. So let's go ahead and go back to the screen here. And let's just say I wanted to make the input a little wider and a little taller. What I could do is add a style attribute. This is actually a very bad practice, having your styles inline like this. We'll talk about this when we get to CSS later. But for right now, just for demonstration purposes, we can go ahead and set the style right here on the element itself. And what I'm going to go ahead and do is add a width. And I'll go ahead and make it, let's make it 300 pixels wide. And let's go ahead and give it a height of maybe 100 pixels. All right. So let's go ahead and go back to our browser and refresh. And notice we have a very, very big input field here now because I set it to 300 pixels wide and 100 pixels tall. Okay, so obviously this is not what we want, but it illustrates the fact that this is an inline block. We can set a width and a height, whereas we can't do that with our label. So let's go ahead and try that same thing with our label. Let's jump back to Visual Studio Code. I'm gonna go ahead and copy this style and add it to my label element. I'm gonna go ahead and save the file, jump back to the browser and refresh. And notice, even though we set width and height, nothing happened. So it's still exactly the same it was before. It's not any wider, it's not any taller. You can see if we look at the label, you can still see it's being highlighted. It's still 38.21 by 18.4 pixels, whereas our input is much larger. It's 300 pixels by 100 pixels, plus the borders and padding and all the other stuff that's being added to it as well. Talk about that a little bit more when we get to CSS. But just to illustrate the differences between these different element types. So let's go ahead and jump back to Visual Studio Code. We will remove the height from the style, and we'll just leave the width to make it bigger. And then finally, we'll go ahead and add our submit button. So we'll say input type here is going to be submit. And then the text for this type, because there is a button type, but this is specifically a submit button. And it's got a special input type of submit. And the value here, what we want displayed in the submit button, is derived by this value attribute. Let's go ahead and call it sign me up. All right, and we'll close off our tags. Remember, inputs are self-closing tags, so we can do this / closing angle bracket, and this is a valid tag here. We also mentioned in the previous video that's technically valid if we leave that off, but out of habit, I like to include them. All right, let's go ahead and just clean this up a little bit. Go ahead and save the form. And now if we refresh, we can see here's our email label. Here's our input where we can go ahead and type our email, and a button that says sign me up. So let's go ahead and just pretend. We'll just say Josh at thecommoncoder.net. And if I click sign me up, it's going to submit the form. technically doesn't do anything because we don't have any JavaScript wired up. We don't have a backend server, which is doing all this stuff locally. So the submission actually doesn't go anywhere. But this is what you would do to build an HTML email submission form. And you have to do the work on the backend or through JavaScript to actually wire it up and store that off in some database somewhere. All right, well, that's going to go ahead and do it for this video. Thank you so much for coding along with me today. If you like what you saw, have any questions, comments, or feedback, please leave those down in the comments below. I hope you all learned something today, or at the very least, I hope that you were mildly entertained. So until next time, be sure to stay curious, and I will see you all in the next video.